In this video, I'll have a shootout between hand-cut dovetails and machine-cut dovetails, and I'll talk about the pros and cons of each method. Hi, I'm Joshua Farnsworth, and welcome to my traditional woodworking school here in Earlysville, Virginia. Years ago, I bought an inexpensive dovetail jig and had a very bad experience with it. It took me several days to figure it out, and it actually turned out that the manufacturer had included some wrong parts, and it took another week to get the right parts. I eventually got it to work, but the process was very frustrating. And the dovetails just didn't look nearly as good as hand-cut dovetails, in my opinion. So I sold that dovetail jig and just stuck to cutting dovetails by hand for a really long time. But the older I get, the more I believe in second chances. So I started looking again to see if there was a good jig on the market that could make decent looking dovetails without too much frustration in the setup process. Because as much as I love cutting dovetails by hand, it becomes quite a chore if I'm making a bunch of chests or boxes or drawers. And I certainly don't ever want to come across as a snobby, academic, white-collar, hand tool purist who cuts dovetails by candlelight while reading French poetry. Nothing against French poetry. But I love buying, restoring, and using my hand tools. Like, I've got hundreds of hand tools. But I also love building furniture in the most efficient and most enjoyable way possible. And that usually means using hand tools, especially when I need some peace and quiet. But if I've got hundreds of board feet of wood to square up, for example, you can bet that I'll use my machines to square it up. And cutting dozens of dovetails on one project also makes a dovetail jig start to sound appealing again. After a little research into the power of woodworking world, I discovered the dovetail jig that is considered by many woodworkers to be the best available jig for non-industrial furniture makers. That would be the Leigh D4R 24-inch dovetail jig. I decided to try out this jig along with my Bosch router on some keepsake chests that I made for my kids this past Christmas. You might have seen them in a couple previous videos. That way, if the dovetails didn't turn out great, my kids probably wouldn't notice. And my plan was to pay attention to the differences between the process and the results of the dovetail jig versus using hand tools. So, here we go. The first metric I kept track of was the setup time. The dovetail jig requires assembling all the parts, cutting a spacer board, setting up the guide bush on my router, choosing which bits to use, adjusting the finger assemblies, setting the router to the appropriate depth, and making test cuts to make sure the settings are correct. I'm not an engineer, so it took me quite a long time to set up and figure out how to use this Leigh dovetail jig. But with the help of my friend Norm, who does love setting up technical things, we were finally able to get a test cut for some through dovetails after a couple of afternoons together. To be honest, the first test dovetails didn't look amazing. But the nice thing is that I was able to micro adjust the settings until I got the dovetails to fit nicely together without gaps. Although the instructions took a while to figure out, I must say that they were better than others I've used from woodworking manufacturers. And keep in mind that if you want to cut angle dovetails or half-blind dovetails, that would take additional time to figure out and set up. In contrast, the setup time for hand tools is quite short, unless of course your tools need sharpening and tuning. Then it could take much longer to set up than the jig. But to summarize what I had to do for setting up with the hand tools is that I just had to grab and set out a dovetail saw, a crosscut saw, a coping saw, a couple of chisels, a marking gauge, a combination square, a bevel square, a pair of dividers, a marking knife, and a pencil. So in the setup time category, the hand tools are the clear winner. If, of course, your tools are in good shape. Once the dovetail jig is set up and figured out, all future dovetails are extremely fast to cut. For the keepsake chests, I was able to cut 16 through dovetail joints in less than an hour, which turns out to be about 64 dovetails. It was amazingly quick. And I found that once I understood the jig, it only took a few minutes to change the size and angle of the dovetail bit for another project. The basic summary of the jig's dovetail cutting process goes like this. I clamp the test tailboard in the jig. This board should be the same width and thickness as the boards you'll be using for your boxes or chests. I space the fingers out to the orientation that I like. Then I tighten the fingers in place. I loosen some brackets, flip the finger assembly over to the tail side, and adjust the scale to the proper settings for my tails. Then I add the desired dovetail-shaped router bit to my router, adjust the depth of my router bit to the baseline on the board, fire up my router, and route out the spaces between the tails. I flip the finger assembly over again to the pin side. Then I put the test pin board in the clamp. Again, it must be the same width and thickness as the actual boards you'll be using. I replace the dovetail router bit with the corresponding straight bit, and then I adjust its depth to the same baseline measurement as on the first tailboard. Then I route out the pins. I test the fit, and if it's too tight, I'll adjust the finger assembly a bit and then run the router through the pins again to trim them. Once I've got a fit that I like, without gaps, I take note of the settings on the scale, and then I can run the pin boards through. And then the tail boards using the same process that I just showed. Once I have the settings dialed in, cutting dovetail joints on a large stack of boards takes very little time. This is the wonderful thing about using a dovetail jig like this. Of course, this is a simplified summary of the use of this jig, so make sure you carefully read the user manual to learn how to use it safely. The dovetail cutting time with hand tools would have taken much longer than it did with the dovetail jig. Even if I was gang cutting the dovetails, it would probably take me a full day, if not more. Some people are faster than me, but I'm pretty proficient with hand tools. In my next video, I'll be sharing my detailed tutorial on cutting dovetails with hand tools, so make sure you're subscribed to my channel so you don't miss it when it comes out. But a quick summary of the process for dovetailing a box goes something like this. First, I scribe all ends of the boards with a marking gauge. Then I use dividers to divide the dovetails up. Next, I use a combination square to carry the lines along the top. I then use a bevel gauge to draw the dovetail angles on the face of the board. Next, I use a dovetail saw to cut right next to the lines, in the waist area. I follow that with a coping saw to cut out the waist. I then use a chisel to cut a little notch on my half pins, and use a crosscut saw to cut them off. I then use a chisel and mallet to chop down to the baseline, and another chisel to clean up the tails and make sure I'm up to the lines. Now the tailboard is finished. Then I set the tailboard onto the pin board and trace the pattern with a marking knife. I then use a chisel to deepen these lines and a combination square to carry the marks down the face of the pin board. Again, I use a dovetail saw to cut along the lines. I use a coping saw to remove the waste. I use a chisel and mallet to chop down to the baseline, and use another chisel to clean up the cuts. Finally, I can test fit the joint. About half the time I have to do some more adjusting with a chisel, especially if I wasn't careful enough when sawing. But finally, the through dovetail joint fits together. Wow, can you imagine doing this 4 times per box multiplied by 4 keepsake chests? So in the cutting time category, the Dovetail Jig is the clear winner. The initial learning and setup time is all pretty much done up front over a day or two, and then it's very fast anytime you want to cut dovetails. I was actually quite surprised by how good the through dovetails turned out on this jig. I used an 8-degree dovetail bit here. No, the jig can't cut super fine dovetails like these hand-cut dovetails because of the router bit shank, but I think they look pretty great nonetheless. But once you have the settings right, these dovetail joints are very tight and consistent, with none of the gaps that I sometimes get when using hand tools. In the joint appearance category, I would have to declare a tie. Now I'll try to compare the costs between the two methods. The cost of the 24-inch Leigh Dovetail Jig runs about $599 and $799 with the accessory kit. The accessory kit has the magnetic router support bar with a shop vac port, all the router bits that you'll need for different sized dovetails, and some other items. Leigh does offer a 12-inch dovetail jig for about $300 if you don't think you'll ever want to make large boxes or chests. I've included links to these dovetail jigs below this video and in the accompanying article. If you don't have a power router, of course, that will add about $150 to $200 onto the cost of this setup. Now for the hand tools. The cost of all the hand tools required to cut the dovetails, which I mentioned earlier, is difficult to estimate. It could easily cost as high as $1,500 if you shop like some of my students and buy higher end saws, chisels, and marking tools. But it could also be as low as a couple of $100 if you went cheap. But it would probably be around $400 to $500 for an average set of new hand tools for dovetailing. So I would probably say that hand tools would slightly win out on the cost factor if you watched your budget carefully. Using a power router definitely introduces a higher risk of serious injury than using hand tools. However, when I use chisels, I quite often come away with some small cuts no matter how careful I seem to be. Whereas I've never had an injury with a router because of all the safety precautions I take. When using the router on this jig, I never put my face or hands down near the spinning bit, so I feel pretty safe actually. So in this category, I'll have to give the two methods a tie, or leave that up to you to decide based on your comfort level around power tools and hand tools. The hand tools definitely win in the noisiness category because the router is quite loud, and even louder when hooked up to a shop vac. I would definitely recommend hearing protection in addition to your safety glasses. If your router is hooked up to a good shop vac, then the dovetail jig method is the cleaner one, as cutting dovetails with hand tools leaves a bunch of wood and sawdust on your workbench and floor. At first, the hand tools seem to be more relaxing when making dovetails, And if you're making just one box, then cutting them by hand certainly wins in this category. But if I've got 64 dovetails to cut, then I'll be finished relaxing in my house after cutting with the dovetail jig, rather than hunching over my workbench all day with an aching back and feet. So what's the verdict? Which is the best method? Well, as you probably suspected, it all depends on your particular situation, your budget, and your level of comfort. So I'm going to let you answer this question for yourself, but hopefully my comparisons in this video helped you with your decision making. For me going forward, if I have to just make one small box or cut dovetails on a case piece or find drawers, then I'm probably going to continue doing it with hand tools. If I've got a bunch of boxes or chests like these, or non-fancy drawers to make, then I'll use the Leigh Dovetail Jig. If you found this video to be helpful or interesting, make sure you subscribe to my channel and click the notification bell so you won't miss out on my next video. If you have any questions or want to share some of your own tips, please do so below this video. And while you're down there, I'd be grateful if you could simply click the thumbs up button. It'll really help me out and doesn't take much time for you. So I'll see you next time here in my shop. Hi, I'm Joshua Farnsworth. If you like this video, I've got a whole bunch of other free woodworking videos and articles at my website, which you can visit by clicking right here. You'll go to woodandshop.com. Down here, if you click, you can subscribe to my YouTube channel. And over here are some really great other videos that I think you might like to check out.